Broadcasting live from the School of Athens, this is Europe and the People Without History with Mr. Olson, everyone's favorite AP World History Review service. Today we're coming at you with the Civilization series on ancient Rome. So if ancient Rome is a place where you need some information, this is where you go. Ancient Rome falls into period 2 of the AP World History concept outline that discusses the classical period, and ancient Rome is, if not the one of the most classical of all the classical empires. So if ever asked by the College Board a very vague and ambiguous question like what led to the rise and fall of empires in the classical period, Rome would be a wonderful place to start. Now before we begin, I want to dispel a lot of myths about Rome. We love Rome in America. Rome is sort of where we get a lot of our heritage from, and so we tend to celebrate them a little bit more than they deserve. So let's talk about the first thing. Romans were clean. We like to see images of ancient Rome and everything's all white and nice, and there's graffiti falling from the sky, a la Ridley Scott's Gladiator, and it just wasn't like that. Romans, poor ones, and most of them were poor, shared a bathroom and even shared communal sponges. That's gross. We also like to think that the Romans were virtuous because they gave us a lot of philosophy and literature and stuff like that. We tend to think that they are awesome and noble. In fact, Romans liked to wear penis necklaces, and in fact, they drew penises on the sides of buildings and a lot of other things. That's also pretty disgusting. We also like to think that the Romans were nice. They were not nice. In fact, they took over a lot of other people and thought of themselves as better than everyone else. And that fits right into the idea that the Roman Republic was egalitarian. The Republic period is often celebrated for having close ties to American government. And that's not the case. In fact, the Roman Republic was marked by conflict, war, and expansion. Not really republican and not really egalitarian, sounds more like an empire. And that brings us lastly to the idea that Julius Caesar's death marked the transition to an empire. But I'm going to argue here that Rome was probably already an empire, and it didn't take Caesar making himself dictator for life or dying to really bring on any imperial type of characteristics. All right, so we're going to talk about Rome through the lens of the spice chart. If you're in my class or any AP World History class for that matter, hopefully you've been exposed to a way of classifying and categorizing civilizations that you come into contact with. We're going to do spice. And the first part of our spice chart is social. So we're going to be talking about genders, family and kinship roles, inequalities, and things like that. So speaking of inequality, let's talk about that Roman society. Roman society was marked by social stratification. There was very few wealthy people called patricians, and there was a whole host of poor people called plebeians. These plebeians are where we're going to start because they make up the bulk of the population. And when talking about them, it's important to recognize that plebeians, their existence and the sheer numbers of them indicated that there was a huge wealth disparity. Contrary to what you might see in the movies, Rome was actually a nation of rural farmers. Most Romans thought that small-scale agriculture was the best and most important job because, they needed to feed all those people in the cities. And therefore, small-scale rural farmers were where it was at. Most people were those. They were not Roman statesmen. So, despite our popular belief that most Romans looked like this, most Romans, in fact, looked like this. Society was structured like a pyramid. The patricians, a small number of them were at the top. The plebeians were in the middle, the large number of them. And then you had slaves and freed people at the bottom. Now, I don't want you to think that the plebeians had no power. They did put pressure on the Roman Senate, and as time goes on, they start to gain more and more power, first with the introduction of magistrates, which are government officials that see through laws, especially among the poor people, and later with developments that we'll talk about in a second. Now, in addition, Rome also had a whole host of slaves. Most slaves were captured in war. However, they came from all over. It's important to note that slavery in the Roman Empire was colorblind, and therefore it was not focused only on Africans. However, Africans did make up some of the slaves. The best known slave in the Roman Empire was Spartacus, and he's well known for staging a revolt of about 3,000 slaves against the empire, which of course was put down because Rome had itself a pretty awesome military. In addition to revolting and working on all of these big, large plantation-type farms that were owned by patricians, slaves also found themselves fighting for their lives in gladiatorial contests in the famous Colosseum. Now, when we think about Roman slavery, it's usually not the first thing that comes to mind, but 35% of the population of the Italian peninsula was comprised of slaves. That is a ton of slaves. In the entire empire, there were 5 million slaves, which means that there were more slaves at the height of the Roman Empire than there were on the eve of the Civil War in the United States. Slavery made up the bulk of Romans' workforce and therefore played into Roman society. Now, as I said before, most slaves ended up in the gladiatorial arena, and even if they were really good ones, they usually ended up dead. Now, when talking about society, we also want to make note of gender relationships. When talking about Roman women, it's important to note that early on in the Roman Republic period, they operated on a system called pater familia, which is Latin for father, family, and it was a system by which the male head of household had legal power over his wife and his kids. Fathers in this system could arrange marriages, determine work for kids, and could even sell those kids in slavery. Now, as time went on, women, especially the wealthy ones, developed more and more power. They started to be able to divorce, they started to be able to inherit and own land. However, from the very beginning and at the very end, certainly there was not equality between the genders. So you see a similarity between Rome and other civilizations of the time period. Now, it's important to note that in actuality, even though they practiced this system of paterfamilia, most less glamorous roles in society fell to women. They took care of the house, they took care of domestic affairs, they raised the kids, and they often chose suitors for kids and where their kids would go either to work or to school. And that was in wealthy milieus. However, the poor women often took to the streets and rioted on their own behalf. So, a famous Roman historian, Livy, in his book, appropriately titled The History of Rome, wrote of a women's march by saying this: "The law said that no woman might own more than half an ounce of gold, nor wear a multicolored dress, nor ride in a carriage in the city or town within a mile of it, unless there was a religious festival. The matrons, whom neither counsel nor shame nor their husbands' orders could keep them at home, blockaded every street in the city and every entrance to the forum. 20 years after it was passed, the law was repealed." And this is a lesson for all of us from history that when you put pressure on lawmakers and aristocrats, you tend to get results. The women in Rome pressured the patriarchy to give them more rights, or at least to throw away the laws that were keeping them in bondage, and lo and behold, they were successful. And the last part of Roman society that I want to discuss is the fact that it was incredibly diverse. There was a recent British cartoon that showed Roman society like this, and it having black people in it, and it of course called all the white nationalists into question, and they got all hot and bothered saying that the cartoon was incredibly wrong. And I'm here to tell you that in fact, Rome was incredibly diverse. Rome had in it Greeks that usually made up tutors in wealthy households. It had people from North Africa that would have looked like Arabs. It had slaves from all over the known world, which means that it would have had black Africans in it. It had Chinese traders, it had Jews, it had Christians, etc., etc., etc. Rome was actually a rather diverse society. Now we're going to move from social into political. When we talk about political, we're obviously talking about political structures, but we're also discussing conflict and expansion. Okay, so we're going to split this discussion of Rome into two phases. The first is going to be the phase of the Roman Republic. So Rome's Republic is founded after the initial monarchy phase doesn't work out because the monarchy oversteps its bounds, as monarchies usually do, and so wealthy aristocrats who don't like one person having the power decide to organize a Senate. Now, the Senate is made up of those wealthy patricians, and as a result of that, the plebeians put pressure on them and forced the Senate to acquiesce a bit and organize what are called tribunes. Now, the tribunes are officials that work on behalf of the plebeians and go out into society to make sure that the laws are carried forth equally. Now, these laws that were created by the Roman Senate put forth a rule by law system that isn't new. We saw this in Babylon with Hammurabi's Code. We saw it with or the early Hebrews and the Ten Commandments. But in Rome, their laws were called the 12 Tables. And they had such interesting laws, like if you were disfigured as a baby or a newborn, you would be killed. You were not allowed to live in the Roman Empire. That's noble and virtuous, huh? Well, if you're going to have laws, you need people to interpret them. So that leads to the great world occupation of lawyers, of which Cicero is one of the first major professionals in that field. Now, the Republican phase is also characterized by intense expansion. Rome during this period expands into Carthage, which is in North Africa. That's right, Rome expanded into Africa. They took over Greece, they took over Gaul, which will become France, which begs the question. The Roman Republic was expanding and taking over people that were of diverse backgrounds. That sounds more like an empire. But as the story goes, uh, eventually Julius Caesar is going to consolidate power into his own hands. He's going to make himself dictator for life, and even though there's still a Senate, he doesn't really want to share the power with the senators, and as a result, he gets knifed 23 times by those senators. Now, most historical narratives say that this is the point at which Rome becomes an empire, but like I said before, they had already conquered a bunch of people. They were probably already an empire. Nevertheless, Caesar getting killed signals a change because it evokes a huge civil war, and out of that civil war, you get an emperor who likes to be sculpted with a baby hanging from his leg. It's weird. I don't know. Okay, so phase two is the empire phase, and this begins under Octavian Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, and he's going to set off this period of hereditary rule by which Romans will breed with each other and give like inbred, weird people the imperial crown, and that's why you have so many bad emperors because they just keep inbreeding with each other. That's hot. Okay, so during this empire phase, we see the expansion of the empire a lot quicker than it had expanded before. And as it expands, they built intricate road systems, usually using the people that they conquered to build the roads. You also see them conquering fringe areas like Palestine, which is going to lead to the Jewish revolt in 66 CE. We're going to come back and talk about that in a second. Now, this time period is usually characterized by historians as Roman peace or Pax Romana. But that begs the question, peace for who? Doesn't sound like it was too peaceful for the Jews. Doesn't sound like it was too peaceful for the people that were getting conquered. So usually we see this as a period of peace and stability within the empire because the rich people are happy. If you were starving on the streets of Rome and you didn't have any bread, chances are this was no Pax Romana for you. Now, there are other important emperors that are worth note. For example, Caligula was a psychopathic weirdo that liked to have orgies. He was not good and often enjoyed watching people being killed. And that he paved the way for Nero, who's famous for having burned down Rome, playing a fiddle while he watched it burn, just so he could build a new palazzo or palace or like city center. That's not very noble or virtuous, is it? Then later on down the road, you have other emperors that make important political decisions, like Diocletian, who splits the empire into two halves because he says that having one big empire is just too hard to administer. So he splits it into a western half and an eastern half. And then you have Constantine, who in 313 CE makes Christianity the official religion. Now, this is sort of how domestic politics were working, but there were also conflicts on the fringes, as I said before. Spartacus's slave uprising signaled that there was a conflict involving slaves, and the Hebrew revolt, which took place in 66 CE, 66 years after Christ's supposed birth, indicated that Christians were not on the scene yet, and Hebrews still ruled the day. This is a famous engraving of the Hebrew revolt. And you probably, if you're in AP World right now, are going to see this in some way, shape, or form on an exam because it's a popular historical document to show that, well, perhaps the Romans weren't that nice to the people that weren't like them, especially those that believed in monotheism, but we'll talk more about that in a second. And then finally, there was constant political and military conflict with Germanic tribes that were on the outskirts of the empire, particularly people who lived in north and northwestern and northeastern Europe. Okay, so now we move away from political and we talk about interaction. It's important to note that when we discuss interaction, we're talking about two different types of interaction between humans and interaction between humans and the environment. Okay, so let's talk about how humans in the Roman Empire altered the environment. The most impressive way they did it was by building these massive aqueducts that carried water from the mountain down into the cities. Now, this might not seem like a big feat, but if you imagine building something like this for 40 miles and measuring a drop of an inch every so often to bring the water into the cities, it's rather impressive. these aqueducts were a big deal because if you were riding into Rome and you saw these things, it just gave you the impression that Rome was awesome. It was another testament to Rome that allowed Rome to think that it was better than everybody else. But it also gave rich Romans wealthy Romans running water. So there you go. There were 3 holding tanks in Rome. One of them was for rich people. The other 2 were disseminated to fountains and public baths. 1.5% got 1/3 of the water. That's just absolutely ridiculous. Okay, anyways, another way that Rome altered the environment was by building this intricate road system that was expansive and connected the empire and all its reaches. So as I said before, when Rome took a place over, it usually enlisted the people that it conquered to building these roads and defense systems. It had walled cities as well, but the roads are probably more well known. There's a famous phrase that says, "All roads lead to Rome." Here's a map of the Roman roads. And now you might figure out why all roads led to Rome. It was the center of the empire. It was sort of the control center of everything. But that's also where most of the people were. And all the roads lead there, which means all the food needs to go there, which is why all the roads go to Rome. Here's a map of how trade worked in the Roman Empire, and you can see that since it was such a big empire, it had a pretty diverse set of commodities. With a diverse set of commodities, you need to bring them into the city, and you need to bring it to the people that have less. If you were poor, you moved to the cities looking for jobs, which is why a lot of the commodities and the roads all led to Rome. But as you see there, the roads allowed for the Roman Empire to trade internally with itself. It was also trading externally or regionally along other trade networks, particularly the Silk Road. Rome found itself situated on the western half of the Silk Road. China, of course, was on the other half, and it gets its name because China was trading silk to Rome. Romans wanted silk. That's was a status thing for them. That's what all the patricians wore, despite the fact that some people hated it. We'll get to that in a second. But Rome was heavily involved in the Silk Road trade, which is why you probably had some Chinese traders within the empire. Now, they were also trading along the sea, particularly in the Mediterranean. The Romans had taken up the legacy of other Mediterranean civilizations and were very good at sailing and using boats. And as a result of that, they were able to create many shipping lanes through the Mediterranean. So the Mediterranean Sea eventually is going to be nicknamed the Roman Lake because the Romans have such strong control over it. But like we said before, there are different commodities throughout the Roman Empire, and they are very good at shipping it all over from one end of the empire to the other. The last type of interaction that was occurring regularly, especially towards the end of the empire's life, was invasions and fighting with people on the frontiers. So Germanic tribes that lived here in northern and northeastern Europe frequently invaded the Roman Empire, as did Asian tribes like the Huns. And so the Romans had a lot of interaction with people outside. Now, the more interaction that you have, either through trade or through war, is going to lead to epidemics and disease. You saw a number of epidemics sweep through Rome, particularly smallpox, which killed a large number of the population. You also see lead getting in the water, so lead being, or not being put perhaps, but seeping into the aqueduct system and Romans drinking lead, which is one explanation for why they fell. I don't know that it is the explanation, but it's one of them. Okay, so now let's move on to culture. And when we talk about culture, we're talking about religions and belief systems and art and architecture. Okay, so the Roman religion was polytheistic and it was heavily influenced by the Greeks. Make no mistake about it, the Romans were obsessed with the Greeks. They saw themselves as direct descendants to many Greek ideas, and that's why if you were to look at a list of Greek gods and Roman gods, you would see that they are mirror images of one another. There are some slight idiosyncrasies between the two, but for the most part, Roman gods mirrored Greek gods. Now, with this polytheistic system, it didn't bode well for monotheists in the empire, which means when Rome took over Palestine and took the Jews under its reign, it did not see their monotheism too kindly, and often times the Jews became scapegoats of the Roman Empire. Not only were they calling into question Rome's polytheism, but they were calling into question the Roman emperor being a god, because to Jews there was only one god, and it was not the emperor. And therefore, Romans didn't like that, and they persecuted the Jews regularly. As I said before, there's a Jewish revolt in 66 CE, which leads to a second Jewish diaspora. The first, of course, was under the Babylonians. A second is going to come under the Romans. Now, these Jews and the chaotic the chaotic situation that's taking place in Palestine is going to lead to the birth of another religion, Christianity. Now, Jesus is a champion of the poor and is an outgrowth of the chaotic and tumultuous context in which he found himself. Judea under the Roman Empire was crazy, and was not good for the people who lived there. And as a result, Jesus is but one of a number of claimed messiahs who tries to tell people that they have a better life to look forward to after this one is over. And many people, especially poor people, liked that message. It was not fun to be poor in the Roman Empire because patricians had all the power and all the money. Now, after Jesus is crucified, Peter, the first pope and one of Jesus' disciples, takes the wing of the Christian church and sort of runs with it, but under the radar a little bit, because he doesn't want the Romans to find out about it, because Romans persecuted Christians heavily at first. It's not until Paul of Tarsus comes along to spread the Christian word throughout the empire, which he can do because he's a Roman citizen, which means he can travel freely throughout the empire. And it's not until him that Christianity takes off. And after he spreads the word through his series of letters that you probably read in church every Sunday if you go to a Catholic Mass, you see the building of monasteries, you see the idea of martyrdom taken off, which is the idea that if you die in this life for the Christian religion, then you will be enshrined for life. Now, the number of Christians, because the Roman Empire is kind of this chaotic place, grows as time goes on, and as a result, Constantine feels the pressure of those Christians and makes Christianity the official imperial religion in 313. Now, I'll take a break from religion and go to Roman literature and philosophy, which is pretty easy because they get all of their ideas from the Greeks. They are posers. That's where we get the phrase Greco-Roman from. Caesar loved Alexander. Rich Romans used Greek slaves as their tutors. They practiced Stoicism, a Greek idea that was a search for universal morals in an interdependent world. They studied history and used it to criticize those in power, however, lauding Rome above all else in the end. Their architecture utilized columns, which was popular among the Greeks. Their architecture also featured arches, which was new, and the Romans perfected it. It wasn't a Greek idea. However, you'll see a lot of similarities between Greek and Roman architecture, and even art for that matter. But when it comes to culture, they're really getting a lot of their ideas from the Greeks. And lastly, we turn to economics, where we talk about labor systems, trade, and commerce. It's important to note that the most important occupation in ancient Rome was farming, which was seen by many as the most important because the massive population needed to eat, and therefore farmers needed to ship all their food to Rome so you could feed the poor people. Now, with that said, they also heavily used slavery, which made it hard for commoners to find work. Unemployment was ridiculously high in the Roman Empire because slaves were doing most of the work on those large farms owned by patricians. Those large farms were called latifundia. Okay, and the Romans were also heavily involved in trade, as we said before, especially for silk, even though many Roman statesmen, especially Seneca the Younger, thought silk was awful, not only because it caused a trade imbalance, but because it was indecent. As he says, I can see clothes of silk if materials that do not hide the body nor even one's decency can be called clothes. Wretched flocks of maids labor so that the adulteress may be visible through her thin dress, so that her husband has no more acquaintance than any outsider or foreigner with his wife's body. Basically, he's saying that a woman in silk shows off more to the public than to her husband. And that, my friends, is how we reach nirvana, Rome, in a nutshell.